How do you do, Lord Novgorod the Great?
Chronicled Veliky Novgorod, Great New Town, has always occupied a special place among other ancient Russian cities. Throughout Russian history until the beginning of the 17th century, it competed on equal terms first with Kiev, and then with Moscow for the right to be called the capital of Russia. We know all this from school textbooks. But the excavations that have been going on for many years in modern Veliky Novgorod give reason to assert that Novgorod on the river Volkhov has never really been a major state and commercial center. In addition, the analysis of ancient annals and chronicles, carried out by Russian scientists, showed that many entries in these texts contradict the generally accepted view of the Russian history in general and the history of Veliky Novgorod in particular. What do we know about it? Is the city on the river Volkhov really the famous Novgorod the Great, the splendor and glory of all Russia? And if this is not so, then which of the ancient Russian cities was the very chronicled Veliky Novgorod? Or maybe Veliky Novgorod is something more than just a city? Few people know that the chronology by which we live now was formed in the 16th century. Only by that time, the medieval scientists attempted to build a certain system of global dates. This officially recognized timescale is called Scaligerian chronology by the name of the most important chronologist of those years, Joseph Scaliger. Many prominent scientists of the past understood that Scaliger's chronology contained significant errors. This was pointed out by Isaac Newton, academician Nikolai Morozov and many others. These errors distorted the whole picture of ancient and medieval history as a whole. The famous chronologist of the 20th century, Beckermann, lamented the chaos of medieval dating. Therefore, the currently accepted version of world history can hardly be considered true. It contains too many far-fetched conclusions, omissions and obvious contradictions. But how to build a new consistent concept of history? This is an extremely difficult task, and it seems that historians cannot cope with it without the help of other sciences and, first of all, without the help of mathematics.
Academician Anatoly Fomenko, a scientist and mathematician from Moscow State University, has been analyzing ancient and medieval chronology since 1973. He managed to obtain a number of fundamental results in this area. In 1981, Gleb Nozovsky, candidate of physics and mathematics, Ph.D., joined the work on the new chronology. Scientists have come to the firm conviction that the versions of ancient and medieval history presented to us from school days contain significant errors, and their root cause is in the wrong chronology. The goal of the scientific project, New Chronology, is to create independent and reliable mathematical statistical methods for dating ancient and medieval events.
For several years, I and my colleagues have been creating such methods. Today there are about 7 of them, and they are based on the processing a large amount of data that is extracted from old texts. These are references, various names mentioned by ancient authors, descriptions of eclipses, and things like that. These methods were later applied to the real chronicles, real annals.
One of the films of our documentary series tells in detail about the unique methods of examination in the past, developed by mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky, which make it possible to objectively, without reference to the Scaliger timescale, analyze the events of real chronicles and annals. Studying ancient documents, scientists began to note many strange inconsistencies that official history passed over in silence. Let's take a closer look at some of them. A well-known chronicler from Arkhangelsk tells that in 1434 the Grand Duke Vasily Vasilievich was defeated near Rostov by Prince Yuri. after which he fled to Veliky Novgorod and from there to Kostroma and Nizhny Novgorod.
The chronicle literally says so, and the word fled is used from Moscow to Kostroma and through Veliky Novgorod. And his other opponent, who after a while also very quickly fled from Rostov the Great to Kostroma, also through Veliky Novgorod. If you look at the map, it becomes quite obvious that through Veliky Novgorod in the modern sense, the city that is located on the river Volkhov, to flee from Moscow to Kostroma, and even more so from Rostov to Kostroma, is completely pointless. Because this is the way there and back. Moreover, today there is a highway, there is a railway, but, in fact, it is an impassable path through swamps, which, perhaps, could be overpassed in winter. And it was, by the way, not a winter time as annals say. Therefore, the question arose, what does the chronicle mean by Veliky Novgorod?
According to school textbooks, Veliky Novgorod is known to us as the largest city in Russia, which played an important role in the Russian history. The first Russian prince Rurik is considered a Novgorodan. Holy Great Prince Vladimir and Yaroslav the Great, and Alexander Nevsky were also called Novgorod princes. Ancient chronicles tell us about this. From the same sources it is known that Veliky Novgorod and Moscow were connected by a great road.
Yes, indeed. Throughout the history of both Kievan and Vladimir Suzdalian Russia, the Grand Dukes of Kiev, Vladimir, Moscow constantly traveled to Veliky Novgorod. But in this case, between Kiev and Chronicle Novgorod, Moscow and Chronicle Novgorod, there should have been well-worn roads, old cities. As a matter of curiosity, what road the Grand Dukes traveled from Moscow to Novgorod on the river Volkhov? The city is completely isolated in this sense. There are no historical centers for many hundreds of kilometers in the direction of Moscow and Kiev. Apart from Pskov, the largest old Russian cities closest to Volkhov Novgorod are at least 500 kilometers away, although usually the largest centers are surrounded by other cities and well-traveled roads.
Trying to figure out where Veliky Novgorod was, after all, and how to understand the indications of the annals, we turn to the history of Novgorod on the river Volkhov and what happened there, what is known there, and whether it corresponds to the descriptions that we know from the annals. Well, it immediately caught my eye that it does not correspond, and moreover, it is very inconsistent. Well, what do we know about Veliky Novgorod from the annals?
From the annals, it is known that Veliky Novgorod was the largest state formation in medieval Europe in terms of area. It was a boyar republic, owning colossal natural resources. The trade turnover had no equal in Russia. Veliky Novgorod was part of the Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northern Europe. The famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, connecting Scandinavia with Byzantium in the Middle Ages, went through Veliky Novgorod.
Let's try to go this way through Novgorod on the river Volkhov. From the Baltic Sea through the Gulf of Finland we get to the Neva, then to Lake Ladoga, and from it along the Volkhov River to Lake Ilmen.
Further, in order to get from Novgorod on the river Volkhov to Russia, that is, to central Russia or to the south, you need to sail along the river Msta. And the Msta is a very turbulent, very rapid river, which is completely unsuitable for trade routes. In addition, if we literally take the words of the chronicles, along this path it was necessary to go up the Dnieper, say, from the Greeks to the Varangians, then make a drag to the river Lovit and then continue the voyage. But on the way one would have to cross the western Dvina. Here on this path, if you take it literally, then, having risen up the Dnieper, you had to make a portage of several several hundred kilometers, crossing the western Dvina along the way. Why, while crossing the Dvina, continue another 100 or even more kilometers of portage, instead of getting on boats and sailing along the western Dvina and calmly sailing into the Baltic Sea, where they headed.
Move on. So, from the annals we know that Russia traded with the West through Veliky Novgorod. Karamzin, in his History of the Russian State, definitely indicates that the main international trade in Russia at that time was not far from Yaroslavl at the mouth of the Mologa River. What to believe, the annals or the history of the Russian state? Maybe they don't contradict each other? Let's remember Karamzin's version, but for now let's take a closer look at the Novgorod Kremlin.
The Novgorod Kremlin or Detonets is located in the very heart of the city. The length of the walls is 1,350 meters. For comparison, the length of the walls of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius near Moscow is 1,250 meters. The Borisogolbsky Monastery near Rostov the Great is 1.5 kilometers, but the fortress city of Pskov is as much as 9 kilometers.
So, in terms of the scale of ancient Russian urban planning, the Novgorod Kremlin is nothing more than a monastery of a rather modest size. The most noticeable detail of the architectural ensemble of the Novgorod Kremlin is St. Sophia Cathedral. In the tourist guide to the Novgorod Kremlin we read, "Until our time, the cathedral has retained its original forms." Has it really never been rebuilt since the 11th century? Let's listen to the guide of the Volkov Novgorod Kremlin.
And one of the oldest churches in our country is our Novgorod Street Sophia Cathedral. In 1045, the construction of St. Sophia Cathedral began. In 40 years, our church will celebrate its 1000th anniversary. That is, our ancestors didn't build for centuries, but rather they built for millennia.
And as for the St. Sophia Cathedral, it looks fairly new. It has no building settlement. An ancient cathedral must have building settlement. This one doesn't have it.
For 9 centuries, a cultural deposit has accumulated around the cathedral, covering the lower part of the building by 2 meters. This is too small for such an ancient building.
In archaeology, there is such a basic concept of cultural deposit. This is household waste, construction waste, everything that was thrown underfoot. All this accumulated quietly, imperceptibly, year after year. In our day, in general, in a modern city, the cultural deposit accumulates as well. Now, if we look at how asphalt is laid, we will see this puff pastry pie. New asphalt is laid on top of the old asphalt. Sometimes the old one is cut off, sometimes not. The same thing happened in the Middle Ages. For many years, over centuries of the city's life, this cultural deposit has been accumulating.
1 meter per century, this accumulation rate of the cultural deposit was calculated by archaeologists on the basis of a puff pastry pie concept, which is a cut of wooden pavements. According to historians, it allows to accurately date the age of the city. The well-known researcher of Novgorod, the head of the Novgorod archaeological expedition, academician Valentin Yanin writes, "Without rotting, the cultural deposit accumulated in the Middle Ages at a rate of 1 centimeter per year. From the middle of the 10th century to the end of the 15th century, it accumulated there by 5.5 meters.
So, for 550 years, a meter per century. Consequently, if we count from the 20th century about 500 years of the cultural deposit of Volkov Novgorod, we get the 15th century as the date of its foundation, and for St. Sophia Cathedral the 17th century, since it was only 2 meters deep. The cathedral, built in the 17th century, is mistaken for antiquity. Why is this happening? Who needed to hide the true age of an architectural structure? Move on. From the annalistic history of Veliky Novgorod, we know a lot about the Novgorod Vladichny courtyard.
The tourist guide to the Novgorod Kremlin says, "The Vladichny courtyard of the Novgorod Kremlin is an outstanding complex of civil architecture structures. Here were located administrative and economic services. Here lived the Novgorod Archbishop, the owner of a huge sovereign treasury. The Council of Lords gathered. the internal and external policy of Novgorod the Great was decided.
Created according to a distinct plan complying with the idea of functional residential architecture, Vladichny courtyard was something completely new in Russian culture and was an outstanding phenomenon of urban planning. It was a state within a state that could provide itself with everything necessary. There were cookhouses, kvass, handicrafts, dryers, baths, forges, a well, cattle and stable yards, warehouses and cellars with supplies. Contemporaries enthusiastically talked about the numerous chambers, passages, a pillar with a clock and other wonders. And the Metropolitan's palace itself was a huge three-story building that stretched along the entire Kremlin wall. And here is what we see today in Novgorod on Volkhov.
So, we are at the Vladichny courtyard of Novgorod. This courtyard is associated with the names of the Novgorod lords, and all the buildings here are associated with the highest ranks of the Novgorod clergy. Next to St. Sophia Cathedral is the Nikitsky building, the 17th century structure.
Note: almost all the buildings that we see now were built in the 17th century and later. But even if we assume that the old buildings were destroyed for some reason, it is difficult to imagine that the mind-boggling Novgorod state in the state for centuries could fit on this patch of land.
It also does not match the chronicle texts. Well, it's just a regular yard. There is a small building of the 17th century. There are dozens of such buildings in Moscow, and there are similar constructions in other cities. Nothing outstanding.
The only building of the Vladichny courtyard, which could have been built during the reign of the archbishops, is the so-called Chamber of Facets.
We learn about the existence of the Chamber of Facets from the Novgorod Chronicles. In 1433, it was built by German craftsmen from abroad. This is what the chronicle tells us. After its construction, the Chamber of Facets of Novgorod received the name Vladichnya, for it was built by order of the Novgorod Archbishop Ephemy II.
The Novgorod Chronicle of 1433 reports, the same summer, the appointed Reverend Bishop Euphemius set up a chamber in his courtyard. And it has 30 doors, and it was made by the German masters, the ones from over the sea with the Novgorod masters. Is this really a masterpiece of ancient Russian architecture of the 15th century, construction of which required joint efforts of Novgorod and German craftsmen sent from abroad? The Vladichny chamber in the form that has come down to us is the most ordinary house of the 17th–19th centuries. There are a lot of such buildings in Russian cities. And how could 30 doors fit here? And the buildings are completely different from how the Chamber of Facets should look like.
For example, in the Moscow Kremlin there is the famous Palace of the Facets. It is immediately obvious that it is faceted. It is lined with faceted stone. And in Novgorod, this is an ordinary house. There are no edges on its walls. The question is, where did they go? These very same faces are made of stone. Everything had to be trimmed, but it is made from regular stones. Ordinary building, ordinary bricks.
It is possible that someone knocked down all the numerous edges and hewed off the walls, but the chronicles do not report anything like that. Then, perhaps, unsightly on the outside, it will surprise us from the inside? Not at all. But the main hall of the Chamber of Facets of Veliky Novgorod was the first Russian diplomatic hall. Here they received the ambassadors of the Moscow Grand Duke, foreign guests, proclaimed the highest decrees. It repeatedly became a witness of fateful historical events. Here the decree of Ivan III was announced on the annexation of Novgorod to Moscow. Ivan the Terrible also arrived here on a denunciation of the Novgorod boyars, and from here he controlled the defeat of Novgorod. By the way, another question is connected with this fact, to which historians cannot find an answer. Let's listen to the guide of the Novgorod Kremlin.
Ivan the Terrible having gathered 10,000 oprichniks, guardsmen, arrived in Novgorod. That bloody nightmarish feast that took place in the Vladiknaya chamber, where the Tsar was received, was remembered with horror by generations of Novgorodians. In the middle of the feast, the terrible hit the floor with his staff. And this was the signal by which the Oprichnina defeat of Novgorod began. In 10 days, the guardsmen slaughtered about 3,000 boyar families.
On the streets of the city, oprichniks behaved as if they were in a hostile city. They killed a lot of people. The bodies were thrown into pits. That was a real massacre. But then why can't archaeologists, who have been working in Novgorod for a long time, find a single mass grave of those years? Let's remember this fact. We will return to it later. Ever since school, we have known about the famous Novgorod Veche, which took place in the so-called Yaroslav's court in Novgorod. In the Novgorod charters they wrote, "The people of Novgorod decided at the Veche, at the Yaroslav's court." Historians claim that Yaroslav's court and the trade place were the busiest places in the city in ancient times. Karamzin mentions that at the ringing of the Veche bell, 10,000 Novgorodians gathered in the square.
Academician Yanin for a long time, by his own account, was looking for Yaroslav's court in Veliky Novgorod. In the end, a court was presented as being Yaroslav's courtyard, on which, as he himself says, about 50 people could fit in, no more. So, his conclusion is that the annals greatly exaggerated the size. That was such a courtyard, just 50 people, a trampled place. Well, excuse me, 50 people gathered at a regular village meeting. I think even more, in any Russian village.
Maybe only the upper strata of society were present at the Veche? But then it would be no longer a Veche.
Here, wherever you look, everywhere it turns out that what is presented in Novgorod on the river Volkhov as remains of Veliky Novgorod. All this does not correspond to what should have been.
Recall the so-called puff pastry pie, a term that came into common use by archaeologists precisely in Novgorod. Let us take the point of view of traditional history. It claims that the annalistic Veliky Novgorod was founded in the 10th century and that this is Novgorod on the Volkhov River. But, in this case, it is clear that as soon as, for one reason or another, the city was founded on the Volkhov swamps, immediately wooden pavements had to be laid.
Academician Valentin Yanin writes, "Every 3 decades, Novgorodians laid new pavements on top of the old ones, still intact, but buried in moist clay soil that preserved the tree, and the pavements grew over the centuries." And so, over 550 years of the formation of the most ancient cultural deposit, 28 tiers of pavements lay one on top of the other here. A giant woodpile of perfectly preserved pine floorings.
The trees of each next floor grew for some time along with those trees that were laid in the previous layer. By comparing the thickness of tree rings, one can determine how long they have been growing together.
In good years, the rings of the tree are thicker and grow well. In dry years, the rings are thinner, and so on. Therefore, the graph of the thickness of the rings seems to tell you the events from the life of this tree. One might expect that for trees of the same climatic zone, these graphs will be more or less similar, comparable. By linking graphs one after another, you can try to build a scale and stretch it into the past, and on this basis, then date new samples.
We did not specifically check the calculations that Yanin and his group carried out in this case, but the idea is reasonable and we completely trust them and think that they most likely were not mistaken here.
Moving on. The perfect preservation of the lower layer of the Volkhov pavements means that this is the first layer.
The first pavement, the first layer is very well preserved, and, therefore, it was indeed the first layer. Because if it were not the first but say the 10th, 20th, and all before that would have rotted, then this destruction would be gradual. Then a completely rotten layer would have been lying under the half-rotten one. And since the first layer is in good condition, it means that it is really the first one and there is nothing under it. Pavements had to be laid in recent times, relatively recent, but up to the time when asphalt laying began. Therefore, if we subtract 550 years from, say, the middle of the 20th century to, conditionally, 1950, when asphalting had already begun, well, we get 1400 for the first layer. But archaeologists date it to the 11th century, 400 years earlier. They get such a picture that in the 11th century started laying pavements. 550 years of laying until the 15th century, and then a problem arises. What to do with the rest of the pavements from the 15th to the 20th century that have not been preserved?
Why then is it considered that the dating of the Volkov puff pastry pie is absolutely accurate and refers to the era from the 10th to the 15th century?
Academician Yanin, the head of the Novgorod archaeological expedition, writes, "For starters, we managed to obtain a relative dendrochronological scale. Then it was possible to get absolute dates. To do this, logs used in the foundations of Novgorod churches were studied, which time of construction was reliably known from the annals."
This means that the chronicles were taken from which the dates of construction of several churches were extracted. According to this dating, the age of the logs of the Novgorod pavements was calculated. But no independent confirmation of annalistic dates has been carried out.
They say the following, that yes, the ancient ones have been preserved, but the new ones, for some reason, have not been preserved. They disappeared, decayed completely and turned into dust. But this assumption requires proof. It's kind of, I would say, very strange. Therefore, when we are told that your research contradicts the dendrochronology of Veliky Novgorod, more precisely, Novgorod on the Volkhov River, we always answer no, their research does contradict, their version does contradict. Ours is in very good agreement.
Based on the study of the puff pastry pie of Novgorod pavements, the authors of the new chronology concluded that the very first settlement on this site should have been dated no earlier than the 15th century, and not at all the 10th.
It is known that there really was a settlement on the site of modern Novgorod on the Volkhov River, which was built as a fortress for the war with the Swedes in the 17th century. The annals of that time say that the locals called this place not Novgorod, but simply Akalatok.
Here is what is written in the tourist guide to the Novgorod Kremlin. In the 14th to 16th centuries, the whole territory of the Detonets, citadel, was called Akalatok, except for the Vladichny courtyard. The name Akalatok came into use instead of the name Novgorod, which originally meant the entire citadel of the 11th-12th centuries, and then the entire territory of the city. Strange text, isn't it? By trying to justify the name of the place, it confuses even more. So, if Novgorod on the river Volkhov is just Akalatok, where was Lord Novgorod the Great? Let's recall the Grand Duke Vasily Vasilyevich and take his route one more time.
One glance at the map was enough to suspect, although it was only a suspicion at first, that Yaroslavl was called Veliky Novgorod, because on the way from Moscow to Kostroma or from Rostov to Kostroma there is such a large city that could pull off the title of Veliky Novgorod, and Veliky Novgorod is the city with the highest profile in Russian history.
Yaroslavl is the largest city on the upper river Volga. The high and steep banks of the Volga and Kotorozl, the deep ravine of the northern side, turned old Yaroslavl into a natural fortified island. In addition, it was well located on the way from Vladimir Suzdalian Russia to Western Europe through the White Sea. This ancient path, just near Yaroslavl, joined with another important ancient route along the Volga.
And all these roads go exclusively through Yaroslavl. Because Yaroslavl becomes a kind of transit point between Moscow, the capital, and those directions. These are Siberia, Mangazeya, Arkhangelsk, Western Europe, and the Orient. So, can you imagine what was going on here?
Let us recall the words of Karamzin. He definitely indicates that the main trade in Russia at that time was at the mouth of the Mologa River, near Yaroslavl, at the intersection of the Severodvinsk and Volga routes.
The Severodvinsk route leads from the Baltic Sea through the North Sea, the White Sea, Arkhangelsk, the northern Dvina, Veliky Ustub, and then through the Sukhana and through Vologda to Sheksna and Mologa. At the mouth of the Mologa, it enters the Volga, joining the Volga route. The Volga route went south and east, and from the east, caravans came from China and India to the Volga.
In fact, it connects the whole of Eurasia with this Moloshki trade, that is, with the Moloshki fair.
The 17th-century historian Deacon Timothy Kamenevich Arvovsky, in his essay on Russian antiquities, writes, "In ancient times there were great trades at the mouth of the glorious Mologa River. Merchants from many German and Polish, and Lithuanian, and Greek, and Roman states came to trade. They say that Persian and of other lands as well. So many ships gathered at the mouth of the Mologa that people crossed the mouth and even the Volga without a bridge, moving from ship to ship. Trades took place on the Moloshki meadow, as the historian wrote, great and beautiful, and it was a circle of 7 miles. By the way, the Scandinavians who traded with Chronicle Novgorod called it Holmgrad.
Kolmogorye is an old Russian port on the White Sea. It retained its commercial importance until the founding of St. Petersburg. For the Scandinavians, trade with Russia was connected precisely with Kolmogorye Holmgrad, the first Russian port on the way to Yaroslavl, where the establishment of foreign merchants was located. There was a brisk trade in foreign goods.
Here were the shops of the Dutch guests, the French, the Germans. But the name Germans, Nemci, in general in Russia was used to call everyone who poorly understood the Russian language or did not speak Russian. Dum, Nemoy in Russian, Germans, Nemci, but there were also Italians, Spaniards, Chinese, Persians. This is a huge variety of goods. And of the 13 royal guests, that is, the richest, well, as you can now say the oligarchs of the 17th century, half lived in Yaroslavl. That is, it was a key city.
In the 17th century, Yaroslavl was the second largest city in Russia, second only to the capital, Moscow.
Western Eurasia carried silver to the Yaroslavl market. The Orient delivered various goods. According to the established procedure, trade was conducted only through the Russian kopeck. For a certain fee, all imported silver had to be recoined. A tax of about 10 to 15% was taken for recoining silver into kopecks. Such was the tax from the entire trade turnover between East and West, which was rigorously collected by the Russian treasury.
So much duty was collected that it was measured in poods, 16 kilogram. The chronicler writes, that duty in poods was 180 poods and more were collected in the treasury of the Grand Duke.
It is known that the first silver mine in Russia was commissioned at the end of the 17th, in the 18th century. Prior to that, all Russian silver was taken from cellars. And in the cellars lay Western European thalers. A very large accumulation of buried treasures is known to be near Yaroslavl. There are Arab coins, the so-called Kufik coins, which is also natural for the center of international trade. Since they traded there, it means that there was a lot of money there. Money, naturally, was hidden from time to time. There must be hidden treasures. There is nothing like that in Veliky Novgorod.
But Yaroslavl presents surprises that official history is unable to explain.
Yaroslavl's Dormition Cathedral. It was built in the 17th century and completely destroyed in the 20th. Excavations are underway here now. Under the very altar, masonry rubble of an older cathedral was discovered, which was destroyed in the 17th century. Along with the masonry rubble, archaeologists saw a huge mass grave.
It's like a mass grave. All the skeletons that have been preserved here, they have traces of violent death. The majority are women and children. Most likely, the people we found here died as a result of some kind of military conflict.
According to official history, Yaroslavl has never been taken by enemy since the invasion of Batu Khan. Massacres in Yaroslavl the Middle Ages are also unknown. It turns out that historians cannot say anything about this burial. And now let's remember Veliky Novgorod. There, according to the chronicles, mass graves should have remained. But there is nothing in Novgorod on the river Volkhov.
And in Yaroslavl, where history does not report any massacre in the 16th century, even in the time of troubles, when the troops of Minin and Pozharsky entered Yaroslavl, there was no battle in Yaroslavl. There, in Yaroslavl, there is such a grave. So, I emphasize that these are old burials. This is not the 20th century and not the 19th. Only bones, no traces of clothes, anything else. But it is under the foundations of the 17th century church and therefore belongs to the 16th century, but not earlier.
The history of Yaroslavl before the 17th century is completely obscure. According to scientists Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky, it is because the true biography of Veliky Novgorod was taken from Yaroslavl and unfairly transferred to another city, Novgorod on the Volkhov.
In Novgorod on the Volkhov there is a small fortress, built no earlier than the 17th century. Yaroslavl, as befits an ancient capital, was a well-fortified city. Even in the 17th century, after a complete defeat, it had 24 towers placed on the rampart, but without walls. Most of the old towers in Yaroslavl were dismantled in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But those that have survived give an idea of the power of the city's fortifications.
It is curious how historical science explains such a number of Yaroslavl towers without walls. After all, it is believed that Yaroslavl was not subjected to defeat. Then who destroyed its walls and when did it happen? Historians offer such an explanation. They say that the powerful fortifications of Yaroslavl that existed until the middle of the 17th century were wooden and completely burned down in 1658. After the fire, a significant part of the towers was restored, but the walls were not restored. Even the logic of ordinary common sense suggests that such a restoration is pointless, because towers without walls are not fortifications. But everything falls into place if we keep in mind that Yaroslavl is Veliky Novgorod. It is known that in the second half of the 16th century all the fortifications of Veliky Novgorod were destroyed. The goal was quite understandable, to deprive the city of its fortifications. To do this, it was sufficient to tear down the walls. The towers were left as useful outbuildings. Does this mean that Yaroslavl was that Veliky Novgorod, the pride and glory of all Russia?
Surely, Yaroslavl was a very good fit and we started digging into this issue further.
The hypothesis of the authors of the new chronology is as follows. The famous in Russian history name, Lorde Novgorod the Great, didn't mean one city, but rather an entire region. This region was the capital until the moment when the capital was moved to Moscow. The composition of the Lorde Novgorod the Great included Yaroslavl, Rostov, Kostroma, Peroslavl, Vladimir, Suzdal and other cities of Vladimir Suzdalian Russia.
Veliky Novgorod, as we now understand, was called the interfluve of the Oka and Volga, that is, the whole of Vladimir Suzdalian Russia in a broad sense, and Yaroslavl is Veliky Novgorod in the narrow sense, or rather, it is Yaroslavl's courtyard of Veliky Novgorod. Because in Veliky Novgorod there is such a famous city itself, and even more famous is the place where they actually gathered at the Veche, where the most important issues were resolved. This is the so-called, famous in the annals Yaroslavl's courtyard of Veliky Novgorod. Yaroslavl is precisely this very Yaroslavl's courtyard, and Veliky Novgorod, as we now understand, is Vladimir Suzdalian Russia between the Oka and Volga rivers.
The Novgorod chronicles speak of the independent ends of Novgorod, which sometimes even fought among themselves. Each end had its own head, its own seal.
Moreover, several seals from each end were at once attached to the Novgorod letters. For example, there are 8 of them on one of the oldest Novgorod letters. From time to time, representatives of the ends converged on a Veche in Yaroslavl courtyard, that is, in the city of Yaroslavl. This is fully confirmed, for example, by Scandinavian sources. The famous 17th century Swedish cartographer Olof Magnus calls Veliky Novgorod a country of cities. How is it depicted on the maps of that time? Here is a fragment of the Olof Magnus map. Please note that the region of Veliky Novgorod is located east of Moscow, and is also marked with the sign of the princely ruler. This corresponds well to Yaroslavl, but does not fit at all with the location of Novgorod on the Volkhov River. Too bad the Swedish cartographer's map ends right here. Here is the famous book by Sigismund Herberstein, Notes on Muscovite Affairs. One of the very first editions, Vienna, 1557. And this is an enlarged fragment of the northwestern part of the map from Herberstein's book. It is immediately evident that the name Veliky Novgorod, Gross Novgorod, for some reason is not accompanied by the symbol of the city. All other cities on this map are marked with small picture symbols showing the exact location of the city, and are also titled. Only one city of Veliky Novgorod is not marked with a symbol.
It is clearly seen that above the upper reaches of the Mologa, which are incorrectly depicted due to the fact that they did not depict its elbows, but drew it straight, and which ended up there in the Pskov region. Above the upper reaches of the Mologa, right on top of the forests, Veliky Novgorod is written in large. It is clear that the people who made this map, firstly, put the name Veliky Novgorod later, because the forests were rubbed out there and this inscription was on top. This is an engraving. Engravings can be edited.
An engraving is an impression from an engraving board on which an image is cut. If desired, you can sand the board in some place and cut out another image there. On the print, it will look as if the pencil drawing was wiped off and something else was added in this place.
And that's what we do see on the map of 1557. Why was it done and who benefited from it? In films of our documentary series, we talk in detail about falsifications in historical science that have significantly influenced our understanding of the past. According to the authors of the New Chronology, until the 17th century, the entire civilized world was united within the framework of a single huge state. At the beginning of the 17th century, it collapsed and many independent small states arose on its ruins. Then a deliberately distorted version of the chronology was developed, what is now called the Scaliger-Petavius version. On its basis, a modern history textbook subsequently arose.
Our methods have discovered that in the teaching of Scaliger-Petavius there are shifts, I repeat, 300 years upwards, 1,000, 1,800 years upwards, closer to us. In other words, it turned out that there are repetitions in this textbook, there are duplicates. No need to think that these are real repetitions, duplicates in the real life of peoples, nations and states. This is not so. Apparently, repetitions arose due to the fact that in the 17th century, chronologists, creating a global version of the chronology and the history based on it, had several versions of old chronicles written by different people, in different languages, in different countries. In fact, these chronicles should have been put on the time axis one on top of the other, that is, without shifting them in time. Then, as we understand today, a correct history textbook would have emerged.
Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky offer their own version of world history, which, at first glance, may seem fantastic. In brief, this is their version. Known in school textbooks, the Mongol Empire, the Empire of Charlemagne, the Great Islamic Caliphate, the Great Celestial Empire, the Roman and Persian empires are all different names for the same realm. The authors of the new chronology call it Russia Horde. This great empire existed on the territory of Eurasia, North Africa, and then America in the era of the 13th–16th centuries. Then the great empire collapsed.
In Russia, the collapse of the empire is known as the time of great troubles. In the West as the era of the Reformation. It was a time of furious wars, the curve up of the empire's inheritance, the redistribution of borders. The people who seized power on the ground were afraid of rise of the former center of the empire of Vladimir Suzdalian Russia. Therefore, by joint efforts they tried to trample down Russia, to erase historical memory of its great past. For this purpose, a version was created according to which the old centers of world domination were located in completely different places, and not in Russia.
The deprivation of historical memory of such important imperial centers, which, as they perfectly understood, being defeated, nevertheless raised their heads and tried to restore their former power, because they felt offended, destitute and understood their fate as injustice. They were so powerful and strong in the past, and now they are humiliated. The natural desire of the population, especially the energetic population, is to restore its former power. The idea was to deprive these centers of their true history and declare that these ancient capitals, in fact, are in completely different places. And for this, they usually chose some backwoods or places convenient for themselves, which they were going to make the new capitals. And in the devastated old centers, they planted belief that these were ordinary, unremarkable and meaningless places in history. It worked very effectively and, in particular, this was applied to Veliky Novgorod.
Created in the 17th century, the new historical science became the most important instrument of the ideological struggle. It did make Veliky Novgorod a small provincial town. In the following centuries, Scaliger's version of history was strongly supported and developed. Historians, including Russian ones, are still doing this and most often, without even suspecting who, when and why directed them along this path. The Romanovs played a big role in this ideological war against Russia. Once in power, from the very beginning they behaved as if they were foreign henchmen on the Russian throne. To erase the traces of the empire, monasteries were destroyed, libraries were burned, ancient chronicles were destroyed, tombstones and frescoes were knocked down.
Go to our famous Andronikov Monastery of the Savior of present days. In the center there is a cathedral. This is one of the oldest cathedrals in Russia. The monastery is connected with the history of the Battle of Kulikovo, as we now well understand. The interior of this cathedral makes a staggering impression. Its plaster was knocked down barbarously, persistently. There are traces of a chisel and a hammer on the stone. They knocked everything down clean, and then they didn't even bother painting new frescoes. The top was painted with lime. All these facts take on a new meaning. It becomes clear that these are not just traces of restoration activities, but traces of a global cleansing of the Russian history. Traces of creating a new version. Traces of destruction of the memory of Russia's past.
What was on these frescoes?
These frescoes, as we understand nowadays, depicted the history of the great Mongol Empire, the history of Russia Horde. There were obviously the titles of the kings' khans, which were later wiped out from the pages of our chronicles and, for sure, their presence on the frescoes has now become unconditionally unacceptable. There were obviously symbols, which also now contradict the new Romanov's version.
And so, according to the authors of the new chronology, the great empire, that made up half the world, ended up under the pen of falsifiers of history and, as a result, was completely forgotten. An effective method of destroying historical memory is well known to those who seized power by force. Erase pride in the great past of the country, and such a people can be easily controlled. The analysis of chronicles and other documents of the past, carried out by mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky, proves that the currently accepted version of history is far from the truth. You can argue or agree with them, but the main thing that the authors of the new chronology call for is to restore the truth about our history.